4 presidents, 23 years of deception, 7,000 pages that proved the American government had systematically lied about a war that killed 58,000 of its own soldiers. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented fact, written by the government itself, hidden in classified vaults and leaked by a man who decided his conscience mattered more than his career. The year was 1971. America was bleeding. Not just in the jungles of Vietnam, but in its streets, its campuses, its living rooms, where families watched body bags come home on the evening news. And then came the bombshell, proof that every administration since World War II had known the Vietnam War was unwinnable, had known they were sending young Americans to die in a conflict they couldn't win, and had lied about it, repeatedly, deliberately, systematically. By 1968, America was tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War had transformed from a foreign policy decision into a national trauma. College campuses had become battlegrounds of protest. Kent State would soon see National Guardsmen shoot students dead for demonstrating. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago had descended into police riots. Muhammad Ali had refused the draft and been stripped of his heavyweight title. The nation watched the Tet Offensive on television and realized everything they'd been told about winning was a lie. Public trust in government was collapsing. Young men were fleeing to Canada rather than fight in a war they didn't believe in. Families were divided. The generation gap wasn't just cultural anymore. It was political and deadly serious. Nearly 300 Americans were dying every week in Vietnam. For what? The government said democracy. The government said stopping communism. The government said we were winning. But the bodies kept coming home, and the war kept expanding, and nothing the government said seemed to match reality. This is where Pentagon Papers enter the story. In 1967, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, one of the architects of American escalation in Vietnam, commissioned a top-secret study. He wanted to know how America had gotten so deep into this quagmire. The result was officially called United States-Vietnam Relations 1945-1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense. 7,000 pages, 47 volumes, classified as top secret. It was a complete history of American decision-making in Vietnam, compiled by 36 analysts who had access to everything: classified cables, internal memos, CIA reports, Joint Chiefs of Staff assessments. And what they found was damning. The study revealed that President Truman had supported French colonialism in Vietnam after World War II, directly contradicting American anti-colonial principles. It showed that President Eisenhower had undermined the 1954 Geneva Accords that were supposed to unify Vietnam through elections, because the U.S. knew Ho Chi Minh would win. It documented how President Kennedy had dramatically increased military involvement while publicly downplaying it. And it proved that President Johnson had planned to escalate the war months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, that he used to justify it to Congress and the American people. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the very reason Congress had given Johnson war powers, had been significantly misrepresented. The second attack that Johnson used to justify bombing North Vietnam probably never happened. But Johnson went on national television and told America they'd been attacked. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and America went to war based on an incident that was at best exaggerated and at worst fabricated. Daniel Ellsberg wasn't some radical activist or anti-war hippie. He was a Marine Corps veteran, a PhD from Harvard, a defense analyst at the Rand Corporation, one of the most prestigious think tanks tied to the Pentagon. He had worked for the Defense Department. He had been to Vietnam as a State Department observer. He had top-secret clearance. He was the ultimate insider, a true believer in American power and purpose. But in 1969, Ellsberg was given access to the Pentagon Papers as part of his work at Rand. And as he read through thousands of pages of classified history, something broke inside him. Here was documentary proof that the government had been lying to the American public for over 2 decades. Every president had known the war was going badly. Every president had been told by their own advisors that victory was unlikely or impossible. And every president had chosen to escalate anyway, to send more young Americans to die. while telling the public that progress was being made and victory was around the corner. Ellsberg read about secret bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia that Congress didn't know about, that the American people certainly didn't know about. He read assessments from the CIA and military intelligence that contradicted every optimistic public statement. He read internal memos where officials discussed how to manipulate public opinion, how to put the best spin on bad news, how to manage the narrative while the war continued to fail. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Ellsberg had friends who had died in Vietnam. He knew families who had lost sons, and now he knew that their government had sent them to die in a war that internal documents showed was probably unwinnable, fought for reasons that kept shifting, justified by deceptions that were documented in the government's own files. In October 1969, Ellsberg made his decision. Working with his friend Anthony Russo, he began secretly photocopying the Pentagon Papers. Night after night, they smuggled pages out of the RAND offices, took them to a friend's advertising agency, and copied them page by page. 7,000 pages. It took months. Ellsberg knew exactly what he was risking. He could be charged with espionage. He could go to prison for the rest of his life. He had young children. He had a career. And he was about to destroy all of it. But Ellsberg had attended anti-war protests and seen the determination of young Americans risking arrest to oppose the war. If they were willing to go to jail for their beliefs, how could he, who possessed proof that they were right, stay silent? In 1971, after unsuccessful attempts to get senators to release the papers through official channels, Ellsberg gave the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times published its first article based on the Pentagon Papers. The headline read, "Vietnam Archive Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement." The story was devastating. It detailed systematic deception across 4 administrations. It showed that the government had consistently lied about the reasons for war, the progress of the war, and the prospects for victory. The Nixon administration went ballistic. Even though the Pentagon Papers covered events before Nixon became president, the leak represented everything Nixon feared about the anti-war movement and the media. If the government couldn't keep its secrets, if analysts could just hand classified documents to newspapers, if the press could publish whatever they wanted, regardless of classification, then presidential power itself was under threat. Attorney General John Mitchell sent a telegram to the New York Times demanding they stop publication immediately. The Times refused. On June 15th, after the 3rd installment was published, the Justice Department went to federal court and obtained a temporary restraining order. For the first time in American history, the federal government had succeeded in imposing prior restraint on a newspaper, stopping publication before it happened. The principle was chilling. The government could censor the press by claiming national security. But the New York Times wasn't alone. Daniel Ellsberg had given copies to other newspapers, including the Washington Post. Ben Bradlee, the legendary editor of the Post, and publisher Katharine Graham had to make an impossible decision. They knew the government would come after them just as it had the Times. The Post was about to go public as a company, and publishing classified documents could destroy their stock offering. Graham's lawyers told her not to publish. Her business advisors told her not to publish. But Graham and Bradlee decided that the public's right to know outweighed the risks. On June 18th, the Washington Post published its first Pentagon Papers story. Within hours, the government obtained another restraining order. Then the Boston Globe published excerpts. Another restraining order. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch prepared to publish. The government was playing whack-a-mole with the First Amendment and losing. The legal question was fundamental. Could the government prevent newspapers from publishing information about government wrongdoing, even classified information, by claiming national security? The Nixon administration argued yes. They claimed that publication would damage diplomatic relations, undermine military operations, and endanger lives. The newspapers argued that the First Amendment prohibited exactly this kind of prior restraint, that the government was trying to hide its own lies behind classification stamps, and that democracy requires an informed public. The case moved with extraordinary speed. United States versus New York Times Khmer reached the Supreme Court in days, not months. The stakes were existential for American democracy. If the government won, it would establish a precedent that classification could override the First Amendment, that presidents could hide their mistakes and deceits behind national security claims, and that the press existed only at the pleasure of the executive branch. On June 30, 1971, just 17 days after the first Pentagon Papers article, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspapers. Justice Hugo Black wrote one of the most powerful defenses of press freedom in American history. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. Justice William Douglas was even more pointed. The dominant purpose of the First Amendment was to prohibit the widespread practice of governmental suppression of embarrassing information. Secrecy in government is fundamentally anti-democratic. The dissenting justices argued that the court had moved too quickly, that national security concerns deserved more consideration, that publication could damage ongoing diplomatic efforts. But they lost. The First Amendment won. The newspapers could publish, and America could read its own government's assessment of how it had been lied into war. The immediate impact was seismic. Public trust in government, already low, plummeted further. The Pentagon Papers confirmed what the anti-war movement had been saying. The war was based on lies. Young men were dying for political considerations, not genuine national security. Presidents had escalated conflicts they knew were failing because they feared looking weak more than they feared sending soldiers to die. The Pentagon Papers didn't reveal nuclear codes or troop positions or undercover agents. They revealed something the government considered far more dangerous, the truth about its own decision-making. And that truth was ugly. It showed a pattern of deception so systematic, so deliberate, so bipartisan, that it shook American democracy to its foundation. Richard Nixon should have been relieved. The Pentagon Papers covered the decisions of his predecessors, not his own administration. He could have positioned himself as the president who inherited a mess, the man cleaning up after democratic failures. But Nixon didn't think that way. To Nixon, Ellsberg wasn't a whistleblower exposing past wrongdoing. He was a traitor who had to be destroyed, an example that would terrify anyone else who might consider leaking. Nixon's response to the Pentagon Papers leak led directly to Watergate. Obsessed with finding and punishing leakers, Nixon approved the creation of a secret unit called the Plumbers, tasked with stopping information leaks. In September 1971, the Plumbers broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for damaging information to discredit him. This was a felony ordered from the White House. The Plumbers then expanded their operations. The same mindset that justified breaking into a psychiatrist, his office to destroy a whistleblower, justified breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The same paranoia about secrets and enemies justified an enemies list, illegal wiretaps, and the abuse of intelligence agencies. Nixon's response to the Pentagon Papers revealed that his administration would break any law, violate any norm, destroy any person who threatened its power. When Ellsberg was indicted on espionage charges that could have sent him to prison for 115 years, the government's case collapsed precisely because of this illegal conduct. The judge dismissed all charges against Ellsberg due to governmental misconduct, including the break-in at his psychiatrist's office. Ellsberg walked free. Nixon did not. The same impulses that drove the war on Ellsberg drove the crimes that ended Nixon's presidency. The Pentagon Papers fundamentally changed American journalism and government accountability. Before 1971, the idea that a major newspaper would publish thousands of pages of classified documents was almost unthinkable. After the Supreme Court decision, it became a cornerstone of investigative journalism. The precedent protected journalists who published classified information about government wrongdoing, from NSA surveillance programs to CIA torture operations. The case established that classification is not absolute, that the government cannot simply stamp secret on its mistakes and crimes and expect the public to remain ignorant. It created space for whistleblowers, though that space remains contested and dangerous. Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and Reality Winner all followed in Ellsberg's footsteps, and all faced the same government fury, the same charges of espionage, the same attempts to destroy them for revealing truths the government wanted hidden. The Pentagon Papers proved that governments lie, not occasionally, not just during crisis, but systematically, as a matter of policy, across administrations, across parties, across decades. Presidents who campaigned on transparency continued the same deceits. Advisors who knew the truth helped craft the lies, and the classification system that was supposed to protect national security became a tool for protecting political careers. Ellsberg risked everything because he believed Americans deserved to know what their government was doing in their name. The New York Times and Washington Post risked everything because they believed democracy requires an informed public. The Supreme Court chose transparency over secrecy because 6 justices understood that governmental power, unchecked by truth, inevitably becomes tyranny. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We only know about the Pentagon Papers because Daniel Ellsberg had access and a conscience. How many similar documents remain classified? How many contemporary lies are being documented in files we won't see for decades? How many whistleblowers stayed silent because they had too much to lose? The Pentagon Papers were released in 1971, but covered events through 1967. Even then, the government tried to stop publication by claiming national security damage, yet no actual harm ever materialized from publication. No agents were compromised. No military operations were undermined. The only thing damaged was the government's credibility, which deserved to be damaged because it had been lying. We live in the world the Pentagon Papers created, a world where trust in government is permanently diminished, where journalists see themselves as adversaries of power rather than stenographers, where classification is understood to be political as much as protective, where whistleblowers are simultaneously celebrated and prosecuted, where the first question about any war is, what aren't they telling us? The Vietnam War continued for 4 more years after the Pentagon Papers were published. Knowing the government had lied didn't stop the war. It didn't bring back the dead. It didn't heal the national trauma. But it did establish a principle. In a democracy, the people's right to know eventually outweighs the government's desire for secrecy. Daniel Ellsberg spent the rest of his life as an anti-war activist, never regretting his decision to leak the papers. He watched as later whistleblowers faced harsher punishments than he did, as the government learned to be more ruthless with those who exposed its secrets. He saw the same patterns repeat in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the War on Terror. Different wars, same lies, same classification of inconvenient truths. The Pentagon Papers remain one of the most important document leaks in American history. They proved that your government will lie to you about war. They proved that classification can hide crimes, not just secrets. They proved that without a free press willing to defy power and whistleblowers willing to sacrifice everything, democracies become theaters where citizens are told stories while real decisions happen in classified darkness. If governments lie in times of war, who will hold them accountable? The Pentagon Papers answered that question. Journalists who refuse to be silenced, whistleblowers who choose conscience over career, and a public demanding truth, even when truth is painful. The question is whether each generation will have the courage to demand that accountability, or whether we'll accept comfortable lies because the truth is too disturbing to face. 4 presidents lied about Vietnam. 1 analyst couldn't live with that lie. 2 newspapers risked everything to publish the truth. And the Supreme Court chose the First Amendment over governmental secrecy. That's the story of the Pentagon Papers. The question is, what are they lying about now?